The slap landed so hard that for a moment, I was not sure whether the music had stopped or whether something inside my head had simply gone quiet. 1 second, I was standing beside the tall windows of a Westchester ballroom, holding a glass of champagne I had not yet touched. The band was playing something slow and warm. The chandeliers threw soft light across the white tablecloths, across the flowers I had paid for, across the faces of guests who had been toasting my son's happiness for the last 2 hours. The next second, my new daughter-in-law's hand was across my face. The sound traveled through that ballroom the way a glass breaking in church travels through a congregation. Not loud enough to shake the walls, but sharp enough to make everyone go still. One by one, the conversations died. The laughter at the bar stopped. A server froze mid-step near the cake table, tray balanced in both hands, eyes wide. 150 people stared at me, and my only son came rushing across the room. For one foolish fatherly second, I thought he was coming to protect me. He was not. He moved in front of his bride, placed his hand on the small of her back, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not concern, not horror, not shame. Irritation. Like I was the one who had caused the problem. "Dad," he said, low and sharp, "why do you always have to make everything so difficult?" That was the moment I stopped being a generous father and became a dangerous one. Now let me tell you what brought us to that ballroom, and more importantly, let me tell you what happened after I walked out of it. My name is Sterling Beckett. I turned 68 the winter of my son's wedding, and until the night of that reception, I still believed a father could love his child through almost anything. I had tested that belief many times. I thought it was unbreakable. I was wrong. I built my life from nothing worth mentioning. I started with one cold warehouse in Akron, Ohio, which I rented with money borrowed from my wife's uncle, and paid back before the first year was out. That warehouse became 3. Then a dozen, then 41 distribution centers spread across 6 states. Real money arrived slowly, the way it usually does when you earn it honestly. Not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of early mornings, frozen loading docks, 2 separate heart scares, and more cold dinners than I can count. My wife Eleanor used to pack my food in foil because she knew I would forget to eat. She knew me better than I knew myself. Most good wives do. Eleanor had been gone for 4 years by the night of Royston's wedding. Pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in October and gone before the following spring, which is the cruelest kind of timeline, because it is long enough to understand what you are losing and too short to ever accept it. There were still mornings when I reached for her side of the bed before the memory arrived. The apartment my new daughter-in-law wanted was not simply an apartment on Park Avenue. It was the home Eleanor and I bought in 1996, when the company finally crossed a threshold from something we were gambling on into something we had actually built. Eleanor chose the kitchen tiles herself. Pale blue, because she said every kitchen needed one gentle color to remind you not to take everything so seriously. She hated the wallpaper in the guest bathroom, but refused to change it because our son, when he was small, thought the little printed birds were hilarious. There was a scratch on the hallway floor from the year Royston rode his scooter indoors and crashed into the umbrella stand. There was a dent on the inside of the bedroom door from the afternoon I dropped Eleanor's oxygen tank and refused to admit I was terrified. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Her sweaters still hung in the closet because I had not yet learned how to open that door without feeling my chest close up. That was the home Adeline Marsh Beckett wanted me to surrender at her wedding reception. Not privately, not kindly, not with the grace of someone who understood what she was asking for, but in the middle of a ballroom with champagne in her hand and her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light, as if my grief were simply unused space and my memories were square footage she could redecorate over. She told me I was alone now. She told me they were starting a life. She told me they would need more room once children arrived. Then she tilted her head and said that handing her the keys in front of all the guests would make a beautiful wedding gesture. That was the word she used, gesture. I looked at her for a long moment. The ballroom noise continued around us. Someone laughed too hard near the bar. A waiter moved past with a tray of desserts no one had touched yet. The band was between songs, tuning softly, and through the tall windows behind us, the November parking lot was pale and cold under the floodlights. I said very quietly, "No, sweetheart, that apartment is my home." Her smile left her face the way color leaves skin when something goes wrong under the surface. First the warmth, then the softness, then everything. And then her hand came across my face. In the seconds after it happened, I remembered details that had nothing to do with the pain. The pale scuff on one of the men's dress shoes near the bar, the half-eaten bread roll on the table closest to us, the way the server with the dessert tray slowly lowered it, as if sudden movement might make everything worse. My ear rang, my cheek burned. I tasted blood where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip. And then Royston was there. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt when I saw my son running toward me, because the truth is complicated, and I have had 4 years to examine it. In that first second, before my brain could correct the instinct, I felt relief. The kind of relief a child feels when a parent appears. The kind that believes the person rushing toward you must be on your side, because how could they not be? He was my son. He knew me. He had watched me do everything for him since the day he was born. Royston placed himself between me and his wife, his hand on her back, his body as a shield, his eyes on mine with an expression I recognized from when he was a teenager, and I had said something he disagreed with, that particular brand of irritation that was really just entitlement dressed up as offense. "It is just an apartment," he said. "Mom is gone. You do not need that much space. This is our wedding day, and you are making it about yourself." I stood there with blood in my mouth and my son's voice telling me that my wife's death had made my home eligible for redistribution, and something happened inside me that I had not expected. I went very still. Not the stillness of a man who is shocked or helpless, the stillness of a man who has just received information he did not want but absolutely needed, and is deciding very carefully what to do with it. Because Adeline's slap had been cruel, but Royston's words were something else entirely. She had struck me in anger and entitlement, he had explained calmly, why I probably deserved it. I looked at the boy who had once cried for 45 minutes over a goldfish that cost 89 cents. The boy who used to fall asleep against my arm while I read him books about astronauts. The boy Eleanor had called her greatest accomplishment on the worst day of her life, when she was too weak to sit up but still wanted to say something beautiful. I understood, with a kind of clarity that does not come often and cannot be unfelt, that my son had learned at some point to read my love as obligation and my boundaries as negotiation. So I did not shout. I did not cry. I took my handkerchief from my breast pocket, pressed it gently to the corner of my lip, and said, "You are right. We should not handle this here. Give me 15 minutes. I need to make one call." Royston's posture relaxed. Adeline's expression softened at the edges. They both heard what they wanted to hear, which was a man backing down from a situation he had no power to win. I let them believe that. I walked out of the ballroom without looking back. The hotel lobby was quiet in the way hotel lobbies are quiet at night, that specific hush of expensive carpet and recirculated air and distant piano music that has been playing so long no one hears it anymore. The young valet near the front desk glanced at my face and looked away quickly. Outside, the November air was cold enough to make my eyes water. I stood under the front awning, the muffled sounds of the reception behind me, and dialed a number I have had memorized for 26 years. Marguerite Donnelly Castellanos answered on the second ring. "Sterling? I need you here," I said. There was the kind of pause she uses when she is deciding between two possible situations, neither of them good. "Where is here?" I gave her the hotel name. "Tell me what happened." I looked through the glass doors at the glow of the ballroom, at the flowers, at the champagne, at the life my son had been building on my money for long enough that he had stopped noticing the foundation. "Bring the binder," I said. And she understood exactly what that meant. Marguerite Donnelly Castellanos had been practicing law since before my son was born. She was 5'2", had the voice of someone who has never once been in a hurry, and had dismantled the financial arrangements of men with far more resources than mine, with the calm efficiency of someone clearing a desk before lunch. She had drafted my estate documents, my corporate agreements, my trusts, and the paperwork that governed every significant financial relationship in my adult life. She arrived 11 minutes later, wearing the clothes she had probably been reading in at home, with a dark coat thrown over them and her hair pulled back. She carried a black leather binder. To everyone in that ballroom, she looked like a tired grandmother who had come to collect someone. To me, she looked like the ending of a chapter. She stopped beside my table, looked at the mark on my face, and said, "Who hit you?" "The bride," I said. "In front of all these people." "Every one of them." She opened the binder. "Then we begin. I will not pretend the next 45 minutes were dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. Marguerite did not stand on a table. She did not make a speech. She sat beside me with her phone and her binder while the wedding continued around us, and she began, one by one, to close things. The West Village apartment, which was in my name and had been housing Royston's life for 3 years, would not have its lease renewed. That call took 4 minutes. The car, which was in my name, would be collected Monday morning. 2 minutes. 3 credit cards, all in my name, all used freely and without particular gratitude. Cancelled. The card company, when told it was the primary account holder calling, moved immediately. The trust that had been distributing money to Royston since his 22nd birthday, structured by Marguerite herself, had provisions for suspension pending the primary holder's review. Marguerite made a note in the binder and moved on. Royston came over once. He tried to read the binder over Marguerite's shoulder. She closed it with one hand and gave him the smile she reserves for situations she has already decided. "Royston," she said, "this does not concern you yet." He walked away annoyed. That would turn out to be his final miscalculation of the evening. A few minutes before midnight, Marguerite closed the binder. I watched Adeline near the dance floor, glowing in her dress, laughing at something someone had said, touching her husband's arm with the ease of a woman who had just won an argument. She had no idea the floor had already been removed from under her. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and crossed the room. I tapped my son on the shoulder. Adeline started to follow. "No," I said gently, "just him." For the first time all night, something uncertain crossed her face. Royston followed me to the corner near the windows with the expression of someone already composing their rebuttal. "Dad, can this please wait until tomorrow?" "No," I said, "it cannot." He exhaled through his nose. So I told him the truth in the same quiet voice I had used all evening. The West Village apartment would not be available to them when the lease ended. The car he had driven to the hotel tonight would be collected Monday morning. His credit cards had been canceled. The trust distributions were suspended. His position at my company, which he had held for 6 years and treated as a formality, would end Monday. The vendors for this wedding, who had not yet been paid, would be billed directly to him and Adeline. Her parents, who were in a suite upstairs that I had reserved, would need to check out by morning. The joint account we had maintained for convenience was closed. Royston stared at me. His mouth opened. No words came. I watched him try to rearrange what I had said into something that made less sense, something that could still be argued with or appealed or paid for by someone else. Then he whispered, "Dad, what are you doing?" "I am letting you be married," I said, truly, honestly, without my wallet supporting what you call your independence. The color drained from his face in stages. First the confidence, then the anger, then something younger and more afraid underneath both of them. "You cannot just do this." "I did it 45 minutes ago," I said. He looked over his shoulder at Adeline, at her dress, her laughter, her certainty. Then he looked back at me, and for one moment, one brief and painful moment, I saw my son. Not the man who had put his hand on his wife's back while her hand was still stinging from my face, but the boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms and fall asleep between Eleanor and me while the rain hit the windows. "Dad, please," he said. "She was stressed. The wedding, the pressure. I will talk to her. She will apologize. Please do not do this." I wanted to believe him. I need you to understand that. I am not a man who found that moment easy. I am not a man who wanted to walk out of his son's wedding having closed every door between them. I had spent 40 years loving that boy, and there is no version of love that makes its own reversal painless. But I also remembered his hand on her back. I remembered him telling me his mother was gone, and therefore my home was available. I remembered that he had not come to my side, not once. So I said, "Your mother and I loved you more than you will probably ever understand." And I walked away before the father in me could undo what the man in me had finally done. I did not stay for Royston's conversation with his bride. I did not stay to hear Adeline's reaction, or her parents, or the guests. I had already given that ballroom enough of myself for one evening. I walked through the lobby. I tipped the valet. I drove home alone. Outside the hotel, the first snow of the season was falling. Small, quiet flakes under the parking lot lights, the kind that do not stick but make everything look for a moment like it might be clean again. I sat in the car for a few minutes before pulling out. My hands were on the wheel. My cheek still ached. The radio was off. In the silence, I could hear the distant sound of a wedding still happening inside without me, and I thought about Eleanor, who had sat in the front row with her framed photograph because there was no other way to bring her. Then I drove home. The calls started the next morning before 7. Royston called 11 times before noon. I did not answer. He came to the Park Avenue building. The doorman had standing instructions. He was not permitted upstairs. He sent a letter. It was returned unopened. He went to Marguerite's office and demanded to see her. Building security met him in the lobby. Then Adeline started calling. The first wave of calls was apologies, or what passed for apologies from someone who had never quite learned the difference between remorse and inconvenience. She said she had been overwhelmed by the wedding, by the stress, by everything that had to be perfect. She said she was sorry for how things had come across. She said she hoped we could all sit down and talk like adults. I noticed she did not say she was wrong. The second wave dropped the apology entirely. She demanded I reverse what she called the damage I had caused. She framed it as punishment, as cruelty, as a father taking out his grief on two young people who had only been trying to plan their future. The third wave came with threats, legal language she had picked up somewhere, references to potential claims, suggestions of what a court might think about a father who withdrew support without warning. Marguerite read one of those voicemails and set down her coffee cup with the measured deliberateness of someone choosing not to say anything too quickly. "She does not have a case," she told me. "I know," I said, "but she may not know that yet." "She will figure it out," I said. 6 weeks after the wedding, Adeline left a voicemail claiming she was pregnant. She was not. And that was the moment I stopped feeling even the smallest grief about what I had decided. Because a woman who would use a pregnancy she did not have as a weapon against a father-in-law she had already struck in public was not a woman my son had married by accident. That had been a choice, possibly the defining one of his adult life. What I had not fully understood until then was that they were not sorry for what had been done to me. They were sorry the money had stopped. The months that followed were, in the way of most consequences, more tedious than dramatic. There was no single confrontation, no moment where Royston arrived at my door with tears and revelation, and we embraced in a hallway while the music swelled. Real life rarely offers those moments, and when it seems to, you should be suspicious of the timing. What happened instead was slow and quiet and instructive. Royston learned, for the first time in his adult life, what it felt like to be denied. He learned that landlords do not wait, that car leases require credit, that vendors who are owed money are not moved by explanations of circumstances. He learned that his name alone, without my name behind it, opened fewer doors than he had assumed. Adeline's parents, who had been sleeping in a paid suite and drinking from a stocked minibar, left the hotel the morning after the wedding, and returned to Long Island considerably less fond of their son-in-law than they had been 24 hours earlier. By the second month, Royston's messages had changed shape. The anger was still there, but it had developed a new quality: desperation. The voicemails stopped being about my cruelty and started being about his survival. He said Adeline was not speaking to him. He said her family blamed him. He said he was sleeping on a friend's couch while they figured out the apartment situation. A friend of Eleanor's brother told me, not because I asked but because grief networks operate on their own logic, that Royston had moved into a small studio in Queens. 4 months after the wedding, Adeline went back to her parents' house in Long Island. A few nights became a week. A week became a month. Before the year was out, the marriage was over. Not dramatically, not with a final speech or a confrontation that clarified everything. It ended the way arrangements end when they were always more arrangement than love. Quietly, with packed boxes and unpaid balances and two people who had mistaken entitlement for compatibility and my money for a foundation. One night, late, long past the hour, when calls are about business and still about something real, Royston left a voicemail I actually listened to. His voice was different. The performance was gone. What was left was just exhaustion and something younger and more honest than anything he had shown me in years. "Dad," he said, "I think I made a terrible mistake. I think I made the worst mistake of my life. I know you may never pick up when I call, but I needed to say it out loud to someone who knew me before I became this. Please call me back." I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that message ended. The phone was on the table. Eleanor's old cookbook was open beside me because I had been trying to make her braised chicken and kept second-guessing the measurements. Outside, Charleston was dark and soft with the kind of October rain that smells like wet leaves and cooler air and the particular mercy of a season changing. Every fatherly instinct I had wanted to call back immediately. But then I remembered his hand, his voice, his careful, calm explanation of why I was being selfish while his wife's fingers were still warm from the impact. I did not call. I am still not entirely sure whether that was wisdom or punishment. I have spent considerable time with that question and have not yet arrived at an answer I fully trust. Perhaps both things can be true at once. 8 months after the wedding, a letter arrived from a woman named Coraline Whitaker Stenmark. She had been Eleanor's roommate in college, back when they were both young enough to believe that the right combination of coffee and stubbornness could solve most things. They had remained close through marriages, children, moves, illnesses, and all the quiet accumulation of a shared life that real friendship makes room for. I had met Coraline only a few times, always briefly, but Eleanor spoke of her the way she spoke of very few people. Like someone who had earned the right to know her completely. I carried the envelope to the porch before I opened it. The sun was going down over the water, turning the fence gold and the garden soft with early evening. My dog, a stubborn basset hound named Custis, was asleep near my feet. A glass of sweet tea was sweating on the small table beside me. The air smelled of salt and something blooming nearby that I had never managed to identify. I held the envelope for a while before I opened it. I was more afraid of the past than I expected to be. Then I read it. Coraline wrote that she had heard about the wedding from Eleanor's brother. She wrote that she was sorry, in the way that people who have known real grief are sorry, which is without any of the performance. She wrote that families have a particular talent for making dignity look like selfishness when someone finally stops absorbing cruelty. Then she told me something I had not known. 3 weeks before Eleanor died, when she was still herself even though the body had largely given up on cooperating, they had spoken on the phone. Eleanor had been thinking about Royston, not because she doubted her love for him, because she had seen something growing in him for years that she was afraid I could not see clearly enough to name. She told Coraline she was worried about the way Royston understood love, that he had learned to receive it without understanding its weight, that every locked door in his life had always had someone, usually his father, standing behind it ready to open it before he ever had to knock twice. Then Coraline wrote the sentence that I must have read 4 or 5 times before I could get to the end of it. Eleanor had said, "If Sterling ever has to choose between his dignity and our son's comfort, I want him to choose his dignity. He has always given too much. He needs to know that is allowed to stop." I put the letter down. I picked it up again. I sat on that porch until the sun was completely gone, and the garden was just shapes in the blue dark, and Custis had woken up and wandered inside without me. And I held those words the way you hold something that has been waiting for you for a long time without your knowing. For months, I had wondered whether Eleanor would have been disappointed, whether the woman who believed in family above almost everything else would have looked at what I had done that night in the ballroom and recognized something cold and unforgiving in it. But she had already answered that question. 3 weeks before she died, too weak to sit upright but still sharp enough to know the exact thing that needed saying, she had told her oldest friend what she needed me to hear. "You have always given too much. You are allowed to stop. I am 72 now." That number still surprises me a little, the way your own reflection can catch you off guard when the light is certain. Some mornings I look in the bathroom mirror and see my father looking back at me, only older and considerably less sure of everything than he always appeared to be. I live in Charleston now, in the small house near the water that I bought after I sold the Park Avenue apartment. I want to be clear about that decision because I know it might look like a defeat. Like Adeline had been right after all, and I had simply arrived at the same conclusion through a longer and more painful route. But that is not what happened. I sold that apartment because I finally understood the difference between keeping a home and hiding inside a memory. Eleanor was not in those rooms. She was in the cookbook. She was in the way I fold dish towels, which she corrected once when we were first married, and I have never folded them any other way since. She was in the habit of checking the weather before I went out, which she taught me, and in the way I overtip in restaurants because she believed in generosity toward people who were on their feet all day. She was everywhere that I had carried her, and that meant she could come with me to Charleston. Packing her things took 6 weeks. I folded her sweaters slowly. I wrapped her photographs myself. I found a grocery list in her handwriting in the kitchen drawer, still in her careful print. I found a birthday card she had bought for Royston and never had the chance to give. I sat on the bedroom floor for a long time with that card in my hands, before I put it in the box I was keeping. Her clothes went to the women's shelter where she had volunteered for 15 years. I thought she would approve of that. Eleanor believed beautiful things should keep helping people after they are no longer needed. I kept 3 sweaters, her reading glasses, the cookbook, and her wedding ring, which I moved from the nightstand to my own dresser where I can see it in the morning. Then I drove south. On Tuesdays, I volunteer at a public library literacy program. I sit across the table from adults who are embarrassed to admit they struggle with reading, and I watch the specific kind of courage it takes to ask for help with something that feels like it should be simple. It reminds me that almost everyone is carrying some private shame they hope no one looks at too directly. I have learned to respect that. On Thursdays, I take Henrietta Calloway to dinner. She is divorced, funny without trying to be, and refuses to let me pay unless I allow her to pick the dessert. Eleanor would have liked her. That thought used to arrive with pain attached to it. Now it arrives clean. I have not seen Royston in 4 years. Every Christmas, a card comes. Same careful handwriting on the front. I keep them in the desk drawer unopened. I am not entirely sure what I am waiting for. Maybe a day when the wound is old enough that I can read what he wrote without feeling the ballroom come back. Maybe just a little more time. There are things that only time can do, and there is no wisdom that accelerates them. Some evenings I sit on the porch with a glass of whatever is cold and think about calling him. I imagine a coffee somewhere quiet, a city where neither of us has a version of the past waiting on every corner. I imagine he would look different. I imagine I would too. I imagine we might find, somewhere on the other side of all of this, something worth salvaging. Maybe. I do not know. What I know with more certainty than almost anything else in my life is this. The most important thing I ever did for my son had nothing to do with money or apartments or credit cards or cars. It was the night I finally told him no. Not because I had stopped loving him, because I had finally loved him correctly. For a long time after the wedding, I told myself the story in the simplest way available to me. The bride was cruel. My son was weak. I was wronged and I responded. That version of events was not false, but it was incomplete in a way that would have kept me from understanding what actually happened. Adeline Marsh Beckett had not manufactured Royston's sense of entitlement. She had simply recognized it. And I had spent the better part of 20 years building it. Not in one dramatic choice, not in one bad decision I could look at clearly and regret. I built it in the accumulation of small surrenders. Every bill I paid when he should have learned to handle it. Every phone call I made so that he would not have to face a consequence he had earned. Every lease signed, every embarrassment quietly absorbed, every hard moment I stepped in front of, so he would not have to stand in it himself. I told myself each time that this was what fathers did, that providing was love, that making his life easier was the same as making his life better. But there is a thing that happens when you consistently remove the friction from someone's life. They stop developing calluses. They stop understanding that resistance is part of how you learn the shape of your own strength. They begin, slowly and without malice, to mistake your presence for a surface they can push against without it ever pushing back. Adeline raised her hand at me in a ballroom full of people because, on some level she may not even have been conscious of, she had assessed the situation correctly. She had watched the way Royston talked about his father. She had seen, over and over, how much I was willing to absorb in the name of keeping the family together. She made a calculation. She was right about the past. She was wrong about the future. The slap was not the beginning of the story. The slap was the bill coming due on years of soft decisions made out of love and fear in equal measure. I was afraid that if I stopped making his life easy, my son would stop needing me. So I kept paying. And in the end, he stopped respecting me anyway. That is the part no one tells you. You think you are purchasing closeness. You think every sacrifice buys another year of love. But sometimes all you are doing is teaching someone that you do not have edges. And people without edges, as it turns out, do not command much care. I should have said no sooner. I know that. I said yes for decades, when the most loving answer would have been to let him figure it out on his own. There is no version of this story where I am entirely without responsibility for what we both became to each other. But I said no eventually, and that, I have decided, is enough. Real love does not always look like an open hand. Sometimes it looks like a closed door. Sometimes it looks like a phone that rings and goes unanswered. Sometimes it looks like a father standing in a cold parking lot in November telling his son, with all the love he still has left, that this is as far as I go. I still hope Royston becomes the man his mother believed he was capable of being. Not the man she was afraid he might become, but the one she saw underneath that. The one who cried over a goldfish. The one who fell asleep between us during thunderstorms. The one she loved so completely and so honestly that even in late weeks, she was thinking about what he would need from me after she was gone. She just knew he would need something different than what I had been giving him. She was, as she almost always was, right? If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Would you have made the same call that night, or would you have found a way to forgive your son before midnight? Would you have opened those Christmas cards, or are there some wounds that still need time? Subscribe to the channel for more stories about betrayal, family, quiet decisions, and the kind of justice that arrives not in a courtroom but in the slow, honest reckoning of a life finally lived on your own terms.